Welcome back, you beautiful complications. You legal headaches. You people who walk into rooms that were never built for you and somehow make the walls nervous. Yes, you. The ones who don't fit cleanly into boxes, who don't tremble on cue, who don't rehearse fear just to make authority feel comfortable. Welcome back to the ones who keep breaking systems by simply existing. Because this story doesn't start with shouting or objections or some dramatic outburst meant for television. It starts with a sentence. A very important sentence. One that was supposed to finish cleanly, neatly, predictably. One that didn't. Picture it. The courtroom is calm. Too calm. Everyone relaxed because they believe in the script. Papers in order. Faces practiced. Confidence everywhere. This place runs on habit. It survives on repetition. Nothing original ever happens here. That's the lie they tell themselves. The judge is talking. Smooth voice. Safe tone. He's already halfway through the sentence that's supposed to end you. This is routine for him. He's handed out outcomes for years without thinking twice. He believes he's untouchable in this chair. Then the sentence breaks. Not loudly, not dramatically. It just dies. He stops mid-word. The silence that follows isn't awkward. It's surgical, sharp, the kind that makes people look up without knowing why. He looks down at the file. Then he looks at you, and he doesn't like what he sees. Not fear, not guilt, not panic, none of the familiar signals. You're sitting there like someone who doesn't need permission to exist, like someone who isn't waiting for the system to validate them. That's when his eyes change. That's when the smile almost forms. Not yours. His. The kind of smile people get when they realize they stepped into something they don't want attached to their name. He's out of this. 4 words. Flat. Clean. Final. No speech, no explanation, no performance. He doesn't argue with himself. He doesn't sell it to the room. He doesn't even pretend this is normal. He just removes himself like someone backing away from a mess they didn't cause, but definitely don't want credit for. And now the fun part starts. The room panics quietly. Papers shuffle like insects. Lawyers lean toward each other, whispering damage control. Faces tighten. The machine sputters because this isn't supposed to happen. Judges aren't supposed to opt out. Authority isn't supposed to blink. But it did. And you? You don't move. No relief act. No gratitude. No shock. You sit there like this was inevitable. Like you already knew the sentence wouldn't finish. Like you've watched powerful people realize too late that touching you would cost them more than walking away. Because the system only works when people cooperate with their own shrinking. When defendants beg. When fear leaks. When guilt looks dramatic. You didn't play along. You didn't decorate yourself for their comfort. They rehearse this place. You don't rehearse anything. They rely on patterns. You break them without trying. This wasn't mercy. Don't insult yourself. This wasn't bravery either. The judge didn't grow a conscience in real time. He did the math. He realized finishing that sentence would follow him. In records, in whispers, in mirrors. So he chose distance. And that's the joke. The system likes to pretend it's strong, likes to posture, likes to punish. But the moment it senses something it can't flatten cleanly, it hesitates. When judging you risks exposing the cracks underneath the robe, authority suddenly remembers it has legs. You stayed still because when power steps back, you don't chase it. You let it leave and enjoy the look on its face as it does. And here's the part they'll never admit out loud. They thought this was a formality. Before you walked in, everything was already decided in their heads. Files stacked neatly like trophies, arguments printed, highlighted, memorized, every sentence timed, every pause practiced. They didn't come to discover truth. They came to execute a routine. The prosecutors were relaxed. That's how you know. No urgency, no hunger, just that lazy confidence people get when they think the ending is guaranteed. They weren't looking at you. They were looking past you, past the chair, past the moment, already imagining how this would look on paper once it was over. To them, you weren't a person. You were a slot, a case number, a line in a calendar, something to process, not understand. They'd seen hundreds like you, or at least they thought they had. Same posture, same fear, same collapse. That's what they expected. And sitting above it all was the judge, years on the bench, reputation polished smooth. This was a man who'd ruled on lives longer than most people keep a job. Untouchable, predictable, safe. The kind of authority everyone trusts because he never surprises them. They trusted him to finish the sentence. Everyone did. The unspoken agreement in that room was simple. You would play your part. You would explain yourself. You would soften. You would show guilt or regret or desperation. Something visible. Something they could point at and say, "There it is. That's what we expected." They needed you to cooperate with the story, because this system doesn't run on truth. It runs on repetition. The same words, the same gestures, the same performances recycled until they feel real. Do it enough times, and they start calling it justice. They rehearsed this. You can tell by how comfortable they were. The prosecutors had their lines ready, their tone already chosen. They weren't listening. They were waiting for cues, like actors who know their marks and just need the other person to hit theirs. And you didn't. That's where it started going wrong. You didn't rush to explain. You didn't decorate your silence with apologies. You didn't perform confusion or fear to help them along. You sat there like someone who didn't need their approval to exist. Like someone who wasn't asking the room for permission. That alone threw them off. They kept pushing anyway, reading from the script, laying out their story brick by brick, painting you the way they needed to paint you so the ending would make sense. They spoke with certainty because certainty is contagious. Say something enough times, loud enough, and people stop checking. But every word they said had to pass one test they weren't prepared for. You. Not your past, not their papers, not their assumptions. You, sitting there in plain sight, alive, calm, uncooperative with their fantasy. And that's when the cracks started showing. Because systems like this confuse repetition with truth. If something has happened 100 times before, they assume it will happen again. They mistake familiarity for accuracy. They forget that patterns only work until something refuses to fit. You didn't need to out-argue them. You didn't need to outthink them. You didn't need to perform some brilliant defense. That's what they expected. A contest. A fight they knew how to win. You didn't give them that. You just existed wrong for their narrative. And that drives them insane. Because now their confidence has nothing to attach to. Their certainty floats with no anchor. Their rehearsed lines sound hollow even to themselves. They start glancing at each other, checking reactions, recalibrating in real time. Actors hate that. They need predictable scenes. They need the other side to follow the script so they can hit their beats and collect their outcome. When that doesn't happen, they don't know what they're playing anymore. The judge felt it too. He'd seen confident prosecutors before. He'd seen weak defendants before. This was neither. This was something else. Something quieter. Something that didn't need to prove itself. And suddenly, What they thought was a formality started feeling risky, because condemning someone like you doesn't feel clean. It doesn't feel routine. It doesn't disappear into paperwork. It lingers. It sticks. It asks questions later, when the room is empty and the robes are off. They didn't plan for that. They planned for you to fold. They planned for obedience. They planned for another easy ending. Instead, they got a presence that refused to make their story comfortable, a case that wouldn't behave, a person who didn't shrink to help authority feel tall. And that's when the confidence began to rot, slowly, quietly. Right there, in the open. Because the moment a system realizes it might be wrong, even for a second, everything it built on certainty starts to shake, and they could feel it coming. And then something subtle happened. Not loud, not dramatic. The kind of thing only power notices when it's already too late. The judge started watching you instead of the case, not the evidence, not the arguments, not the neat little story being read out loud. You, sitting there, still, upright, unbothered, not performing a single emotion they were trained to expect. That's when the air changed. He noticed it in pieces at first. The way you didn't shift in your seat when accusations landed. The way your shoulders stayed relaxed instead of tightening. The way your face didn't try to help anyone feel comfortable. No fear leaking out. No guilt signals. No nervous habits to latch onto. That absence hit harder than any confession ever could, because authority is trained to read fear. They look for it the way predators look for a limp. It's how they decide who's guilty before they admit it to themselves. Fear validates their power. Fear makes the story feel true. And you weren't afraid. Not the polite kind, not the hidden kind, not even the controlled kind. You weren't suppressing anything. There was nothing to suppress. You sat there like someone who had already survived worse rooms than this. That confused him. So he checked his notes again. He glanced down like the paper might explain what his eyes couldn't. Like the file would correct the feeling crawling up his spine. He read the same lines again. Same facts. Same claims. Same structure. Nothing changed. Except you were still there. Still calm. Still silent. Still not cooperating with the emotional script. Still not shrinking. That's when irritation crept in. Not at you. At the situation, because this wasn't how it was supposed to feel. Judging usually feels clean to him, heavy, maybe, but familiar. This felt off, like the ground shifted half an inch and no one else noticed. He looked back at you. Longer this time. And here's the joke they never catch until it's too late. When authority can't read you, it starts projecting. It fills the silence with its own doubts. Every pause becomes a mirror. Every still moment starts reflecting things it buried a long time ago. You didn't accuse him of anything. You didn't challenge him. You didn't resist. You just refused to perform fear. And that broke the rhythm. He expected flinches. He expected tension. He expected the subtle signs that say, yes, this process is working. He expected your body to confess before your mouth ever could. Nothing came. So he checked the notes again, adjusted them, lined them up, touched the edges like that might restore order. Authority hates uncertainty. It needs cues. It needs reactions. It needs proof that it's still in control. And the lack of fear made him question that. Because when someone doesn't fear judgment, it forces a terrible thought. Maybe the judgment isn't as absolute as he believes. Maybe the chair isn't as powerful as it looks. Maybe the person sitting in front of him isn't what the system prepared him for. That's when the cracks widened. Not in the case. In him. Every time he looked at the file, it felt flatter, smaller, less convincing. Every time he looked back at you, the contradiction grew. The story said one thing, reality said another, and the gap between those two kept stretching. This is the part authority hates the most. When fear doesn't show up, guilt stops feeling certain. When submission doesn't arrive, dominance feels performative. When silence doesn't beg, power starts to feel ridiculous. They never tell you this. But calm is dangerous in rooms like that. Calm doesn't argue. Calm doesn't plead. Calm doesn't need permission. Calm just sits there and lets everyone else spiral. You weren't being brave. You weren't trying to intimidate anyone. You weren't making a statement. You were simply not cooperating with their emotional economy. And that's when the judge realized something was wrong. Not with you, with the process, with the expectation, with the assumption that fear equals truth and confidence equals justice. So he kept looking down, and back up, down, and back up. Like reality might change its mind if he checked often enough. It didn't, because when you don't perform fear, they panic. Quietly, professionally, internally. The kind of panic that doesn't shout, but corrodes. And the air in that room knew it before anyone else did. Something fundamental had shifted. And it wasn't shifting back. And once that shift happened, everything they said after started sounding wrong. They kept going anyway. The accusations were read out loud, one by one, in that practiced tone they use when they think words are enough. Clean sentences, strong verbs, confident claims. They described actions, motives, intent. They painted a version of you that was sharp, dangerous, convenient. And the whole time, you were sitting right there, breathing, listening, existing. That's when the mismatch became impossible to ignore. Every accusation landed and then had nowhere to stick, not because it was disproven, not because someone objected, but because the human in the chair didn't line up with the character in the story. The words described one thing. Your presence showed another. The judge felt it immediately. You could see it in the way his jaw tightened, the way his eyes flicked back to you after each claim, like he was checking to see if the story finally caught up. It never did. Each sentence made the gap wider. Each detail made the picture less believable. They said, threat. You looked calm. They said, reckless. You looked composed. They said, dangerous. You looked grounded. That's when discomfort set in. Because systems like this don't actually care about truth. They care about alignment. They need the story to match the person so the punishment feels justified. They need you to look the way they describe you. They need you to help them believe it. You didn't. So now every accusation sounded exaggerated, desperate, like overcompensation, the kind people use when they're trying to convince themselves as much as others. The judge could feel it. His body reacted before his logic did. He shifted in his chair. That's a tell. Each new charge made him more uneasy, not more certain. Not because the facts were weak, but because condemning you started feeling dishonest, like signing his name under something he didn't actually believe. And that scared him, because once authority senses dishonesty in itself, the whole illusion starts cracking. Judges are trained to decide, to conclude, to close loops. This felt like forcing a lie into permanence. The system hates that feeling. So do the people who benefit from it. This is where their playbook always shows. When the story doesn't work, they exaggerate the villain. They darken the language. They lean harder on labels. They inflate intent because they don't know how to deal with someone who doesn't fit cleanly into good or evil. They need monsters. Not because monsters exist, but because monsters make punishment easy. Monsters justify shortcuts. Monsters silence doubt. Monsters make authority feel noble instead of lazy. And you refused to be one. They weren't just accusing you of actions. They were accusing you of surviving wrong, of not breaking the way they expected, of adapting instead of disappearing, of standing upright in a world that prefers its defendants small. That's what made the judge uncomfortable, because deep down, he knew this trick. He'd seen it before. The way systems turn survivors into villains to avoid asking harder questions. The way resilience gets reframed as threat. The way endurance becomes suspicious. Every time they described you, he looked at you again. And every time, the story lost a little more credibility. Not loudly, quietly. The worst kind of loss. You didn't need to interrupt. You didn't need to correct them. You didn't need to defend yourself. Their words were doing the damage all on their own, because coherence beats innocence in rooms like that. You don't need to be perfect. You don't need to be spotless. You don't need to fit their idea of good. You just need to be real enough that their fiction starts to wobble. And it did. The judge could feel himself being pulled in two directions. On one side, the system, the routine, the comfort of finishing the process. On the other, the human in front of him who refused to match the mask being forced onto him. That tension kept building. He started taking longer between sentences, pausing where he normally wouldn't, letting silence creep in. That's not hesitation. That's resistance trying to disguise itself as thought. Because condemning you now wouldn't feel like justice. It would feel like maintenance, like protecting a story that no longer held up under light. And authority hates being exposed that way. They can forgive mistakes. They can forgive corruption. They cannot forgive being seen. So the room grew heavier, not louder, heavier. Like everyone sensed that something had gone off the rails and no one wanted to say it first. The accusations kept coming, but they sounded weaker each time, like echoes in a room that stopped believing in them. The judge wasn't convinced anymore. He wasn't even neutral. He was uncomfortable, and that discomfort was the beginning of the end. Because once a judge feels dishonest sitting in his own chair, once the story stops matching the person, the system has a problem it can't proceduralize away, and it was only going to get worse from there. And then he did what people like him always do when the ground starts moving under their feet. He called a recess. Not the polite kind, not the scheduled kind, not the calm, orderly pause everyone is trained to expect. This one was abrupt, sharp, out of rhythm, the kind of recess that doesn't ask permission from the room, just takes it. Confusion spread instantly. Lawyers looked up too fast. Prosecutors froze mid-thought. People in the room exchanged looks like they'd missed a line in a play they thought they knew by heart. This wasn't in the plan. This wasn't how the process was supposed to breathe. But he didn't care. He stood up and left. And suddenly, the room was just a room again. No voice guiding it. No authority holding it together. Just people pretending not to panic while their certainty drained out of them. Because everyone in that space understood something, even if they didn't say it yet. This wasn't procedural. This wasn't routine. This wasn't about time. This was escape. Behind closed doors, away from the audience, away from the script, away from the performance, the judge sat alone, robe off, voice gone, no one to impress, no one to perform certainty for, just him and the file. He opened it again. Same pages, same words, same accusations. Nothing had changed on paper, and yet everything felt different. The case didn't read the same anymore. It felt thinner, less solid, like a story that only works when you don't look at it too closely. So he started looking closer, not like a judge this time, like a man. He reread testimonies and noticed what wasn't there. He traced timelines and saw gaps he'd ignored for years. He followed patterns that didn't point where they were supposed to. Connections he'd brushed past before suddenly stood out like stains. And worse than that, he started remembering. Not this case, other ones. Faces he'd forgotten, decisions he'd justified, lives he'd altered without ever really seeing the people attached to them. He told himself he was just doing his job, that procedure equals justice, that following the rules absolves responsibility. That's the lie they all tell themselves. Procedure isn't justice, it's insulation, it's distance. It's how people in power avoid feeling the weight of what they do. Follow the steps, check the boxes, finish the sentence, and you never have to ask if you were right. Until now. This case didn't let him hide behind that comfort. Sitting there alone, he realized something ugly. He'd been avoiding moments like this his entire career. Moments where the story didn't align cleanly. Moments where deciding would mean owning the consequences instead of burying them under formality. How many people had been crushed before this moment? How many times had he finished the sentence because it was easier than stopping it? How many lives had passed through that chair without ever getting this pause? That thought stuck, and it hurt, because this wasn't about you anymore. It was about him, about the line between judgment and conscience, about whether he could keep pretending those were the same thing. He could feel accountability creeping in, slow and heavy, the kind that doesn't shout, the kind that sits with you, the kind you can't outrun by citing rules. This recess wasn't a break. It was a reckoning delayed too long. And here's the part they won't admit. You didn't force this. You didn't manipulate him. You didn't corner him. You didn't expose some secret with clever words or strategy. You didn't do anything dramatic at all. You revealed something that was already there. Your presence removed the cover. Your calm took away the noise. Your refusal to perform stripped away the excuses. Once that happened, the weight he'd avoided for decades had nowhere left to go. He sat there knowing one thing for sure. If he went back out there and finished that sentence, he would be lying. Not to the room. To himself. And that was a cost he suddenly wasn't sure he was willing to pay. So he stayed seated, alone, silent, letting the truth catch up to him at last. And outside those closed doors, the system waited, uncomfortable, exposed, and very aware that whatever happened next would not go the way it was supposed to, and time stretched in that quiet space. Not because the clock slowed down, but because avoidance ran out of places to hide. Sitting there alone, the judge finally understood something that had nothing to do with statutes or evidence or precedent. This wasn't about guilt. It never was. Guilt is easy. Guilt is paperwork. Guilt is something you assign and move past. This was about whether he could live with himself after. Because the moment he imagined finishing that sentence, really imagined it, something in him recoiled. Not fear of backlash, not fear of appeal, fear of recognition, the kind that follows you home, the kind that sits with you at night when the noise is gone. He saw it clearly now. Ruling on you wouldn't be an act of justice. It would be an act of self-protection disguised as duty. It would mean choosing the comfort of the system over the discomfort of truth. And that realization hit harder than any argument in the room. Judging you meant judging himself. That's the part authority never plans for. They're trained to look outward, to evaluate, to conclude, to close files and move on. They survive by never looking back, by convincing themselves neutrality exists, by pretending the chair makes them objective. It doesn't. The chair just hides the consequences. In that room, alone with no one to perform for, the illusion collapsed. He wasn't a neutral observer anymore. He was a participant, and whatever he decided next would define him far more than it would define you. He tried to frame it differently, tried to tell himself it was still just a case, tried to lean on habit, on training, on routine. But every version of that story felt thin now, hollow, like repeating a lie after you already know it's false. Because condemning you wouldn't feel clean. It would feel cowardly. It would feel like choosing the system because it was easier than choosing honesty, like hiding behind procedure because owning the truth required too much spine. That's when the thought formed. Quiet, heavy, unavoidable. I can't touch this. Not because it was too complex. Not because it was too controversial, not because it was unclear, but because touching it would stain him in a way no robe could cover. This is what they never say out loud. Authority isn't afraid of being wrong. It's afraid of being exposed, afraid of moments that force a choice between image and integrity, afraid of cases that don't let you pretend neutrality is real. Neutrality is a myth they sell to sleep at night, and you shattered it without saying a word, because once he admitted that judging you meant judging himself, there were only two honest paths left: either proceed and accept what that made him, or step away and admit limitation. Everything else was theater. So stepping down stopped being a failure. It became the only move that didn't require lying. The only move that didn't demand self-betrayal. The only move that let him walk away without pretending he didn't see what he saw. That's the irony. The system would call it recusal, procedure, ethics, some tidy explanation to make it palatable. But beneath that language was a far simpler truth. He didn't want his name on this, not because you were dangerous, because you were clarifying. And clarity is lethal to systems built on selective blindness. When he stood up to return to the courtroom, he already knew what he was going to do. Not the words, not the phrasing, just the outcome. He would not finish the sentence. He would not pretend this was business as usual. He would not participate in a ruling he couldn't stand behind. Power hates moments like this, moments where it has to admit limits, where stepping back is the only way to keep a piece of yourself intact. But here's what matters. The moment power refuses to judge you, something irreversible happens. It admits it doesn't own you. It admits it can't reduce you. It admits that forcing a verdict would cost more than it's willing to pay. That's not mercy. That's surrender, dressed up as professionalism. And whether anyone in that room understood it yet or not, the balance had already shifted. The authority that walked out of that chamber was not the same authority that walked in. Because once someone in power chooses conscience over completion, the system doesn't just pause. It exposes itself. And you had already won something they could never take back. And when he came back into the room, everyone felt it before he said anything. The door closed. The sound landed wrong. Softer. Heavier. Like the room itself noticed something was off. He didn't walk the same. Didn't carry himself the same. The confidence was still there, but it was thinner now. Careful. Like someone handling glass instead of steel. The room went quiet on instinct. People straightened up without knowing why. Pens paused. Breaths held. You could see it ripple across faces. Prosecutors sensed it first, that subtle tightening around the eyes, that look people get when they realize the plan they trusted might not survive contact with reality. The judge sat down, and for the first time, he didn't look above it all. He looked human, focused, measured, almost restrained, like someone who had just made a decision they couldn't undo. No small talk, no easing back into procedure, no attempt to pretend nothing happened. He cleared his throat once, adjusted his robe, and the sound of that fabric felt louder than it should have. Then he said it. He was recusing himself from the case, effective immediately. No long explanation, no legal gymnastics, just a clean removal, calm, direct, unavoidable. And the room cracked, not loudly, not all at once, in waves. You could feel the shock before you heard it, like a delayed reaction. Prosecutors stared, lawyers froze mid-note. Court staff looked up like they'd just heard the wrong name called. Whispers started spilling out sideways, sharp and uncontrolled. Judges don't do this. That's the unspoken rule. Authority finishes what it starts. Power doesn't step back. It pushes through. It doubles down. That's how the illusion stays intact. And here it was, unraveling in public. The confidence that filled the room earlier evaporated fast. The structure they trusted suddenly looked fragile, temporary, embarrassing, like a stage set that wobbles when someone leans on it too hard. You could see it on their faces. Panic dressed up as professionalism. Confusion pretending to be calm. People scrambling internally to understand how this just happened without anyone raising their voice. They built a throne on confidence alone. And the moment confidence cracked, the whole thing looked ridiculous. The prosecution tried to mask it, straightened papers, shifted posture, as if body language could patch a hole that big. They avoided looking at you now, not out of fear, out of discomfort. You had become the thing they didn't want to acknowledge, because this wasn't supposed to happen. The system depends on momentum, on decisions flowing forward, on authority appearing solid even when it isn't. A judge stepping down mid-case is a public admission that something went wrong, and systems hate public admissions. It exposes how fragile they really are. You didn't say a word. You didn't need to. You didn't argue. You didn't interrupt. You didn't challenge anyone. You didn't even look satisfied. You stayed exactly the same as before. Calm, present, unmoved. That's what made it unbearable for them. Because reality had argued for you. Every second you sat there without reacting was another reminder that this collapse didn't come from resistance. It came from contradiction. From a story that couldn't survive contact with the person it was aimed at. The judge avoided your eyes now, not out of shame, out of respect. The kind people feel when they know they just stepped away from something bigger than procedure. The courtroom staff moved like they were underwater. Delays, awkward pauses. No one quite sure what the next step was supposed to be. The script had ended early, and no one had practiced this part. That's when it became obvious. Without certainty, the system looks lost. Without confidence, authority looks like costume jewelry. Shiny until you realize how light it is. This was supposed to be routine, clean, predictable. Instead, it turned into a quiet spectacle, not because someone caused chaos, but because order couldn't justify itself anymore. And through all of it, you stayed still, because you didn't need to win an argument. You didn't need to prove a point. You didn't need validation from the room. Power had already exposed itself. The judge stood up to leave, and this time the weight followed him. The whispers grew louder as he walked out. Not gossip, recalculation. Everyone in that room suddenly had to rethink what they thought authority meant. And you? You sat there like someone who understood exactly what just happened. The system blinked in public, and everyone saw it. And once the judge left the room, the damage didn't stay behind with him. It traveled. At first, it looked like confusion. Prosecutors huddled closer than usual, voices low, words sharp. They weren't debating the case anymore. They were recalculating, rerunning scenarios that weren't supposed to exist. Flipping through papers like the answer might be hiding between margins. They weren't asking, how do we win? They were asking, how did this go wrong? That's fear, by the way. Not the loud kind, the professional kind, the kind that shows up when confidence stops protecting you. Because now your case wasn't just a case, it was a problem. Phones started buzzing outside the room. Messages moved fast. Quiet updates sent upward, sideways, anywhere but directly at you. Other judges heard about it before the recess was even officially logged. A sentence stopped mid-air. A bench abandoned. A recusal without a clean excuse. Whispers love hallways like this. And whispers don't carry facts. They carry implications. They don't say what happened. They ask what it means. Suddenly your file felt heavier than it should, not because of what was in it, but because of what touched it. One judge stepping back is an anomaly. 2 is coincidence. 3 is precedent. And precedent is what terrifies them. Because precedent spreads. No one wanted to be the next name attached to this. No one wanted to be the one who finished the sentence the last judge refused to complete. Careers don't end with scandals most of the time. They end with footnotes. With quiet moments, people remember when your name comes up later. Authority fears that kind of memory, so they hesitated. Meetings were called that didn't exist on the calendar. Opinions were requested without being requested. Everyone suddenly wanted more time, more review, more distance. The language changed overnight. Caution replaced certainty. That's when you know the system is scared. Not scared of losing a case. Scared of creating a moment it can't control. Scared of being the one who turns this into something bigger than procedure. Scared of being remembered as the person who ignored the warning signs. And that's the joke. They claim to serve justice, but what they really serve is continuity, smooth operation, the appearance that everything is fine, injustice can be tolerated, inconsistency can be explained away, but hesitation at the top, that's contagious. So they protect themselves. Institutions don't have courage. They have instincts, and their strongest instinct is self-preservation. When something threatens the structure, they don't confront it. They circle it. They delay. They hope it resolves itself quietly. This is herd behavior dressed up as authority. Robes don't change that. Titles don't change that. Power still moves in groups. No one wants to be alone when the ground is unstable. No one wants to step forward when stepping forward might expose something rotten underneath. So your case became radioactive. Not dangerous. Untouchable. People spoke about it carefully. Like the wrong tone might invite consequences. Like proximity alone might stain them. That's what happens when authority loses confidence. It becomes superstitious. They feared precedent more than injustice. They feared reputation more than truth. They feared being first more than being right. And all of this was happening without you doing a single thing. You weren't campaigning. You weren't making noise. You weren't pushing. You were sitting still while the system argued with itself. That's the leverage they never teach anyone about. When systems hesitate, individuals gain space. When authority pauses, power redistributes, not loudly, quietly, through delay, through doubt, through people suddenly refusing to commit. They didn't want to destroy you anymore. They wanted to avoid you, because avoiding is safer than deciding. Because stepping around a problem feels better than admitting you don't know how to handle it. Because silence looks neutral from the outside. But silence is a confession. Every moment they delayed was proof that something about you didn't fit their machinery. Every careful step was proof that the system wasn't as confident as it pretended to be. And the longer they hesitated, the more obvious it became. This wasn't about the law anymore. It was about risk. Who wants to be the judge who didn't hesitate when everyone else did? Who wants to be the one who finished the job after another judge publicly walked away? No one. So they waited. They whispered. They stalled. They watched. And in that hesitation, the balance tilted further away from them. Because once a system shows fear, even quietly, it never fully recovers its authority. People remember. They adjust. They move differently. And somewhere in those halls, behind those closed doors, the question kept circulating like a bad smell they couldn't scrub out. What is it about this person that made a judge stop? They didn't have an answer. And that scared them more than any verdict ever could. And that's how it stopped being a case and started becoming a story. Not the kind that shows up in headlines. The other kind. The kind traded quietly between people who know how power actually works. In side rooms, in hallways, in lowered voices that never make it into transcripts, and they talked about it carefully. Not what happened, how it happened. A sentence that didn't finish, a pause that lasted too long, a judge who looked up, saw something he couldn't unsee, and decided to leave before it followed him forever. Those details mattered more than the outcome ever could. Because rulings can be appealed, stories can't. The sentence that never finished took on weight. People repeated it slightly differently each time. Not because they forgot, but because myth doesn't need precision. It needs shape. And this one had a clean shape. Authority mid-sentence, silence, withdrawal. That's how legends form. They tried to keep it contained, of course. They always do. Institutions hate stories they don't author, hate moments they can't footnote into harmlessness. They prefer clean conclusions, final orders, neat endings they can archive and move past. This one refused to close. Because no verdict ever replaced the moment. No ruling ever overwrote the pause. The absence became the thing people remembered. The restraint, the refusal, the quiet honesty that broke protocol, and the judge. His career didn't end. That's what makes it worse for them. It changed. His name became associated with that moment. Not weakness, not fear. Something far more dangerous. Discernment. The kind that says, I know when not to proceed. The kind that doesn't pretend every problem is solvable by force. They don't like that. They prefer judges who finish sentences, judges who don't hesitate, judges who don't introduce doubt into the machine. But now there was a living reminder that stepping away was possible, that conscience could interrupt momentum. You can't erase that with procedure. They tried to bury it under language, ethics, standards, formalities, all the usual tricks. But none of that stuck, because the story didn't belong to the paperwork. It belonged to memory, and memory is a hostile witness. People brought it up in other cases, not directly, just enough to shift tone. just enough to introduce hesitation, just enough to remind everyone that authority had blinked once and might blink again. That's how myths survive. Not by being shouted, by being referenced. You don't need closure for that kind of impact. You don't need a final chapter. You don't even need to win in the traditional sense. Sometimes the pause does more damage than the decision ever could. They wanted an ending. They got a legend, and legends don't resolve. They linger. They change how people move, how they speak, how they decide. They introduce doubt where certainty used to live. They force questions into places that relied on obedience. This one asked a simple question no institution ever wants to answer. What happens when judging someone reveals more about you than them? They don't have a response for that. No form, no template, no safe wording. So they pretend it didn't happen while adjusting everything around it. That's the irony. They hate stories they can't control, yet those are the only ones that last. Rulings fade, files close, systems evolve just enough to survive. But myths outlive everyone involved. And this one didn't need fireworks. It didn't need outrage. It didn't need applause. It just needed a sentence to stop halfway through. That was enough. Because now, no matter how they proceed, no matter who takes the bench next, there's something they can't undo. The knowledge that once, very publicly, authority chose not to finish. And that choice changed the shape of the room forever. And when you finally stood up to leave, nothing about you had changed. No victory posture, no collapse, no transformation arc they could point to and study later. You walked out the same way you walked in, calm, unrushed, intact, like someone who didn't need the room to confirm anything. Behind you, the system was still scrambling. People whispered, phones lit up, plans were rewritten in real time. They told themselves it was temporary, that it would stabilize, that a new judge would be assigned and everything would return to normal. It won't. Because whoever takes that bench next will already know the story. They'll know a sentence stopped midair. They'll know someone smarter than them chose distance. They'll feel the weight before they ever open the file. That's compromise before contact. They'll pretend it's business as usual. They'll hide behind language and schedules and reassignment notices. They'll call it procedure because that word sounds clean. History will call it retreat. That's the part they can't control. You can rewrite records, you can sanitize documents, you can bury details under policy. You can't unring a moment where authority blinked in public. The illusion cracked, and everyone saw it. You didn't fight the system. You didn't challenge it head on. You didn't try to burn it down. You did something far more dangerous. You let it look at itself, and it didn't like what it saw. That's why you didn't need to argue. That's why you didn't need to perform. That's why you didn't need to win in the way they understand winning. Systems don't collapse when they're attacked. They collapse when they're exposed. They'll keep pretending they're in control. They'll keep moving forward. They always do. But they'll move differently now. Carefully, quietly. Like something that remembers being startled. Because somewhere in that building, in that room, on that day, authority learned a lesson it never wanted. Not everyone can be judged. Some people simply make the system step back. And once that happens, there's no going back. If you felt that pause, that silence, that moment authority flinched, you already know why you're here, so hit like, subscribe, and stay close.